Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the most powerful military in human history, the United States Armed Forces, was not acting on its own interests. That the missiles raining down on Tehran were not launched because of American strategy, American intelligence, or American necessity, but because one man, sitting in a palace in Riyadh, made a phone call. And somewhere between a $1 trillion arms deal and a decades-long geopolitical chess game, the American war machine became, effectively, a weapon for hire. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is what is unfolding right now. By the time this video is over, you will never look at the Middle East the same way again. Because right now, as you watch this, oil is trading at over $114 a barrel. The Strait of Hormuz, the single most important waterway on planet Earth, is practically shut down. Dubai's airport briefly went dark. Saudi oil fields are burning. Bahrain has intercepted over 100 missiles in 2 weeks. And Iran's new supreme leader, wounded and disfigured from an Israeli strike, is promising that the Gulf will never know peace again until every single American base is gone from the region. This is not a regional skirmish. This is not a limited military exchange between rival powers that will burn itself out in a few days. This is the beginning of something the world has not seen since the Second World War. And at the center of it all, pulling strings that most people cannot even see, is Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, and a financial relationship with the United States that is so deep, so deliberate, and so dangerous that historians may one day call it the greatest strategic miscalculation in American history. Stay with me, because what I am about to show you connects dots that no mainstream media outlet has been willing to connect. And the revelation at the end of this video about who really triggered this war, how they triggered it, and what it means for the entire global order will fundamentally change how you understand everything happening in the world right now. We are going to walk through this step by step. Every piece of evidence, every financial link, every military decision. And when all of it is laid out in front of you, the picture that emerges is not just alarming, it is historic. Let us go back to the beginning, not the beginning of this particular conflict, not the airstrikes, not the drone swarms, not the oil fires. Let us go back to the moment this entire catastrophe was set in motion. Because to understand where we are today, you need to understand a deal so large, so consequential, and so quietly executed that most Americans have no idea it even happened. When Donald Trump made his first foreign trip as president in 2017, he did not go to London. He did not go to Paris or Berlin or Tokyo. He went to Riyadh. And in that single visit, he signed what was, at the time, the largest arms deal in American history. A staggering $350 billion in weapons, military equipment, and defense contracts spread over a decade. $350 billion. To put that in perspective, that is more than the entire annual GDP of countries like South Africa, Denmark, or Malaysia. In one handshake, in one trip, in one afternoon of ceremony and sword dancing and photo opportunities. And over the following years, that number grew. By the time we reach today, analysts and defense researchers estimate that total Saudi military investment in American defense contractors, weapon systems, lobbying infrastructure, and political influence networks has crossed the $1 trillion threshold. $1 trillion, flowing from Riyadh to Washington, D.C., purchasing everything from F-15 fighter jets and Patriot missile batteries to think tank influence, congressional relationships, and, as we are now seeing, something far more dangerous, military commitment. Because here is what that money actually bought. It did not just buy weapons, it bought dependency. It bought a situation where American defense contractors, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, became so financially entangled with Saudi Arabia that a war in the Gulf became, for them, not a tragedy, but an opportunity. Every Patriot missile battery that fires in Bahrain costs approximately $3 million per interceptor. Every time a Saudi air defense system lights up the sky over Riyadh, someone in Connecticut or Texas is counting profits. The war economy and the Saudi economy became one and the same thing. And when your economy is tied to a country's security, that country's enemies become your enemies, whether you chose them or not, whether American voters were ever asked about it or not. This is the trap Mohammed bin Salman laid. And he laid it with extraordinary patience and extraordinary intelligence. Because MBS understood something that Washington's foreign policy establishment has been slow to admit, that in the modern world, the most powerful weapon is not a missile or a drone or a nuclear warhead. It is financial leverage, and he accumulated that leverage systematically, deliberately, and over years. Not through corruption in the crude sense of the word, but through something far more sophisticated. The slow, methodical construction of a financial architecture that made American interests and Saudi interests appear to be the same thing. Think about what happened after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in 2018. Every single intelligence analyst, every human rights organization, every credible journalistic institution in the world concluded that Mohammed bin Salman ordered the killing of a Washington Post journalist inside a Saudi consulate in Istanbul. The CIA itself concluded with high confidence that MBS approved the operation. And what happened? Nothing. Absolutely nothing of consequence. A few frozen assets, some sanctioned officials, no accountability at the top, no real price paid. Because by that point, the financial entanglement was already too deep. American politicians who might have pushed back were receiving campaign donations from Saudi-aligned PACs. American media companies were taking Saudi advertising dollars. American universities had Saudi endowments. American real estate markets in New York and Los Angeles and Miami were absorbing Saudi wealth. The leverage was everywhere. It was in the system. And MBS watched all of that unfold and understood that he had successfully purchased not just weapons, but impunity. And if he could purchase impunity for a political assassination, the killing of a journalist who worked for an American newspaper, what else could he purchase? What was the limit of what $1 trillion could buy in Washington? The answer, as we are now discovering, is a war. Let us talk about what actually triggered the current conflict. Because the official narrative, the one you hear on cable news, is that the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes against Iran's nuclear facilities in response to an imminent nuclear threat. And while there is truth to that framing, it is dangerously incomplete, because it leaves out the phone calls, it leaves out the private meetings, it leaves out what sources inside the State Department and multiple investigative journalists at outlets, including the Washington Post, have been reporting for weeks. That in the days and weeks before the strikes, Mohammed bin Salman made multiple direct calls to the White House, multiple personal conversations with President Trump. And in those calls, according to these reports, he did not just express support for military action, he argued for it. He pressured for it with the full force of his personal relationship with the administration. He reportedly warned that if Iran was not struck now, Saudi Arabia's own security would be existentially compromised, that the window for action was closing, that waiting meant losing. Now, we have been in similar situations before where an ally pushes Washington toward military action. Israel has done it. The Gulf states have done it for decades. That is how alliance politics works. But what made this moment different was the leverage MBS was able to deploy alongside the argument. At the exact moment these conversations were happening, Saudi Arabia was in the process of finalizing a new phase of economic agreements with the United States. Investment commitments through the Saudi Public Investment Fund into American infrastructure, technology, and defense sectors worth hundreds of billions of dollars. The timing was not accidental. The financial and the military were being negotiated simultaneously. And when you are negotiating a financial deal worth that much money, while simultaneously asking for military action, you are not making a request. You are making a transaction, a very large, very consequential transaction. When the transaction went through, the strikes happened. American B-2 bombers, the most sophisticated aircraft in the history of warfare, capable of flying from the Indian Ocean to central Iran and back without refueling, struck Iranian nuclear facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. Israeli F-35s simultaneously struck command and control infrastructure, air defense installations, and military communications networks across Iran. The operation was coordinated, precise, and devastating, and for approximately 48 hours, there was a strange, eerie silence from Tehran. The world waited. Analysts debated whether Iran would respond at all, or whether the regime had been so fundamentally damaged that it would have no choice but to accept the new reality. Some experts argued that the strikes had broken the regime's will to retaliate. Others argued that Iran's leadership was in such chaos, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei dead, his son Mojtaba wounded and disfigured in a subsequent strike, that no coherent response was even possible. Cable news panels filled hours of airtime with confident predictions that Iran would stand down. They were wrong. What came next was not chaos. It was not the improvised, desperate lashing out of a wounded regime with nothing left to lose. What came next was a military doctrine that Iran had been developing, practicing, and refining for over a decade. A doctrine built around one core strategic insight, that in any conflict with superior conventional military power, the way to survive is not to match that power directly, but to make the cost of victory unbearable for the victor. Iran calls this the Ring of Fire strategy, and on day 3 of the conflict, it activated in full. And the Gulf states that had quietly cheered the American strikes were about to discover what it meant to be inside the ring. The first targets were not American assets. Iran is too sophisticated, too strategically disciplined for that. Striking American forces directly in the opening phase would have given Washington the justification for total war, the kind of existential response that even MBS might not have wanted. Instead, Iran went for something more elegant and more devastating. It went for the Gulf states themselves, the countries that had, through their silence, their complicity, their diplomatic cover, and their financial relationships with Washington, enabled the strikes to happen. In the calculus of Iranian strategic planners, those countries were not innocent bystanders. They were co-conspirators, and they were going to pay a co-conspirator's price. Saudi Arabia was first. And the scale of what Iran unleashed was staggering. In a single 24-hour period, over 50 drones, Shahed 136 variants and more advanced models that Iran had been developing quietly for years in defiance of international sanctions, were launched toward Saudi territory. The targets were not random. They were chosen with surgical precision by military planners who had spent years studying satellite imagery, infrastructure maps, and the vulnerabilities of Saudi oil facilities. The eastern province, where the vast majority of Saudi oil infrastructure is concentrated, where Aramco's sprawling facilities pump wealth into the Saudi economy and, by extension, into the global energy system, was the primary target. The Abqaiq processing facility, which handles roughly 7% of the world's daily oil supply on its own, refineries, pipelines, and in a move that sent a message about the depth of Iranian intelligence capabilities, the approaches to Riyadh itself. Saudi air defenses, American-made Patriot systems that Riyadh has spent tens of billions of dollars acquiring and maintaining, performed better than many analysts had feared. Of the 51 drones launched in that initial wave, Saudi forces intercepted the majority. But the majority is not all of them, and the ones that got through did not need to destroy everything. They needed to destroy confidence. They needed to prove that even with American weapons, even with American training, even with $1 trillion in military investment, even with all the financial architecture that MBS had so carefully constructed, Saudi Arabia could not guarantee the security of its own oil fields. And in that single night of drone strikes, they succeeded in proving exactly that. Oil markets, already nervous since the initial strikes on Iran, went into full panic mode. Within hours of the first confirmed hits on Saudi oil infrastructure, crude spiked to levels not seen since the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, and then it kept going. Because traders understood what the think tanks and cable news panels were only beginning to articulate, that this was not a one-time strike. This was the opening move in a campaign that Iran had spent years designing precisely to make the economic cost of any conflict with it unbearable for everyone in the region. While the Saudi strikes were dominating the headlines, something arguably more consequential was happening in the United Arab Emirates. Because Dubai is not just a city. Dubai is a symbol. Dubai is the physical embodiment of the Gulf's transformation from desert trading posts to global financial hubs. Dubai's skyline, the Burj Khalifa piercing the sky at over 800 meters, the sail-shaped Burj Al Arab rising from its artificial island, the extraordinary geometry of the Palm Jumeirah, represents hundreds of billions of dollars of global investment. Russian oligarchs, Indian billionaires, Chinese sovereign wealth funds, European luxury brands, American technology companies, hedge funds, private equity firms, all of them have money, assets, and operations in Dubai. Dubai is where East meets West in the language of commerce. It is where the global financial system touches the Gulf. And Iran knew exactly what hitting Dubai would do to global confidence in a way that hitting a remote oil facility simply would not. A Shahed-type drone, Iranian-made, GPS-guided, relatively inexpensive to produce and extraordinarily difficult to intercept reliably in large numbers, detonated near the Fairmont Hotel on the Palm Jumeirah, close enough to create a massive explosion visible from miles away across the water, close enough to force a brief closure of Dubai International Airport, the second busiest airport in the world by international passenger volume, through which over 90 million travelers pass each year, close enough to trigger emergency protocols at the Jebel Ali port, the largest seaport in the Middle East, through which roughly 70% of the UAE's imports flow, and close enough to force ADNOC, the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, to temporarily halt operations at a refinery processing nearly 1 million barrels of oil per day. The message was not subtle. The message was delivered in the only language that global capital understands, the language of risk. And that message was heard in every trading floor, every insurance underwriting room, and every boardroom from London to Singapore. Qatar was next. And Qatar's situation is particularly significant because of what Qatar represents in the global energy equation. Qatar is the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. European countries that have been desperately trying to wean themselves off Russian energy since the Ukraine conflict have been increasingly dependent on Qatari LNG to heat homes, generate electricity, and run industrial processes. Japanese and South Korean economies run on Qatari LNG. Asian manufacturing, which produces the consumer goods that stock store shelves across the Western world, is powered in substantial part by energy from Qatar's North Field, the largest single natural gas reservoir on the planet. When Iranian strikes forced Qatar to suspend LNG production, even temporarily, even partially, the shockwaves went far beyond the Gulf. European energy markets went into crisis mode. The price of natural gas in Europe spiked dramatically in a matter of hours. Countries that had been carefully managing their strategic reserves suddenly found themselves calculating worst-case scenarios. Energy ministers across the continent began making urgent calls to Washington and Riyadh, asking the question that was now consuming every government and every boardroom on the planet. How long is this going to last? And nobody had a good answer. Because nobody in any government anywhere had planned for this. Nobody had built their energy security strategy around the assumption that Qatar's LNG exports could be disrupted. That assumption had always seemed too extreme, until now. And now we arrive at the single most consequential geographic point in this entire conflict. The single body of water that connects all of these individual crises into one unified global catastrophe, the Strait of Hormuz. If you have never thought carefully about the Strait of Hormuz before, start now. Because this is where the modern world is most vulnerable. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway, at its narrowest point only about 21 miles wide, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea beyond. And through this 21-mile gap flows approximately 20% of the world's total oil supply, every single day, in tankers, enormous floating vessels carrying millions of barrels of crude oil from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, and Qatar, to the refineries and power plants and factories of Asia, Europe, and beyond. 20% of the world's oil, through a gap you could drive across in 30 minutes. That has always been the vulnerability at the heart of the global energy system, and Iran has always known it. Iran has been developing its Strait of Hormuz strategy for decades. The IRGC Navy, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps naval forces, has spent years practicing swarm tactics, deploying fast attack boats, conducting mining simulations, testing anti-ship missile batteries positioned on the Iranian coastline overlooking the strait, and operating submarines in the shallow waters of the Gulf. They have wargamed the closure of the strait more times than any Western military planner can count. They have modeled the economic consequences. They have studied the insurance protocols and the shipping industry's risk thresholds. They designed their strategy not just to close the strait militarily, but to make it economically irrational to sail through it. And when the order finally came down, they were ready. The mining campaign began quietly. Iranian forces, using a combination of traditional contact mines and more sophisticated influence mines, the kind that can be programmed to activate based on the acoustic signature of specific vessel types, began seeding the shipping lanes through the strait. Not enough to close it completely, not in the first hours, but enough to trigger the insurance protocols that govern global shipping. Because here is something that most people do not realize about how the global economy actually works. You do not have to physically block a shipping lane to stop traffic through it. You just have to make the insurance cost high enough that it becomes economically irrational to sail. When Lloyd's of London and other major maritime insurers began raising war risk premiums for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz, in some cases to levels 20 or 30 times their peacetime rates, shipping companies began rerouting. Not because they were physically stopped, because the math no longer worked. And when the math does not work, the ships do not move. And when the ships do not move, the oil does not flow. And when the oil does not flow, the world economy begins to seize up like an engine running without lubrication. Tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz dropped dramatically within days of the mining campaign beginning. Some estimates suggest it fell by 60 to 70% of its normal volume. The implications of that number are almost impossible to overstate. Consider what flows through that waterway on a normal day. Saudi crude heading to Japanese refineries that power one of the world's top 3 economies. Qatari LNG heading to South Korean plants that manufacture the semiconductors inside the phone you are holding right now. UAE oil heading to Indian refineries that fuel 1.5 billion people. Iraqi crude heading to European markets that are already fragile from years of geopolitical turbulence and post-pandemic economic instability. Kuwaiti exports, Bahraini refined products, all of it suddenly in question, all of it disrupted, all of it held hostage to a conflict that was set in motion by decisions made in Riyadh and Washington. And here is where we need to connect this back to the financial architecture that MBS built over a decade. Because Saudi Arabia cannot export its oil if it cannot get tankers through the strait. The vast majority of Saudi oil goes east to Asia, and it goes east through the Strait of Hormuz. The pipelines that bypass the strait, primarily the east-west pipeline that runs across the peninsula from the eastern province to Yanbu on the Red Sea coast, have capacity, but not enough capacity. They can handle roughly 5 million barrels per day at maximum throughput. Saudi Arabia produces approximately 9 to 10 million barrels per day. The arithmetic does not work. Even if the pipelines run at absolute maximum capacity around the clock, Saudi Arabia loses roughly half its export capacity if the strait is effectively closed. Which means that the trillion-dollar strategy MBS deployed to purchase American military protection has produced an outcome where his own country's economy is being held hostage by the very enemy he asked America to bomb. The irony is almost too much to process. MBS spent $1 trillion to create a security architecture that was supposed to make Saudi Arabia untouchable. And instead, he has triggered a conflict that has made Saudi Arabia more economically vulnerable than at any point in decades. But the economic damage extends far beyond Saudi Arabia or even the Gulf region. Let us talk about what is actually happening to the global economy right now in real time, because this is the dimension of this crisis that most people are not fully grasping. Oil at $114 a barrel is not just an energy price. It is a tax on every single economic activity that requires energy, which is to say, every single economic activity that humans engage in anywhere on the planet. When fuel prices spike, transportation costs spike. When transportation costs spike, the price of every physical good that moves from one place to another spikes with it. Food, medicine, manufacturing components, consumer electronics, construction materials, agricultural inputs, everything that arrives at a port gets loaded onto a truck, gets driven to a warehouse, and gets sold in a store. All of it becomes more expensive. Not a little more expensive. Significantly more expensive. And that price increase does not stay in the Gulf. It does not stay in the Middle East. It goes everywhere. It goes to supermarkets in Ohio, and grocery stores in Nigeria, and convenience stores in Jakarta, and farmers markets in Brazil. It is a global inflationary shock with the specific and cruel quality of hitting the poorest people hardest. The families that spend the highest proportion of their income on food and energy and basic goods. The International Monetary Fund had been, just weeks before this conflict erupted, cautiously optimistic about the global economic outlook for 2026. Inflation in most major economies had been trending in the right direction. Interest rates were expected to ease as central banks gained confidence that the post-pandemic inflationary cycle was ending. Consumer confidence was recovering. The word soft landing was being used in circles where just a year ago economists were debating the probability of a severe recession. All of that is gone now, erased. Every economic projection, every growth forecast, every inflation model has been thrown out because nobody built their models around the assumption that the Strait of Hormuz would be semi-closed in March of 2026. There's no version of any mainstream economic forecast that accounts for this, and that means the world is navigating without a map. The financial markets are responding accordingly. Global equity markets have entered freefall. The Dow Jones Industrial Average has shed trillions in market capitalization in a matter of days, wealth that represents pension funds, retirement accounts, college savings, and the accumulated economic security of tens of millions of ordinary families who have no idea why their investments are collapsing and no ability to stop it. European markets have been hit even harder because Europe's energy exposure, post-Russia, post-Ukraine, now post-Gulf, makes this crisis existentially threatening in a way that it is not yet, for the United States. Asian markets, dependent on Gulf energy to power the manufacturing export machines that generate the growth numbers Beijing and Tokyo and Seoul point to as evidence of their economic vitality, are in deep distress. And then there is the banking sector. Because modern financial institutions are deeply exposed to Gulf sovereign wealth funds and Gulf real estate and Gulf investment vehicles in ways that most retail investors and most voters do not fully appreciate. When Gulf sovereign wealth funds, Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund, Abu Dhabi's ADIA and Mubadala, Qatar's QIA, all of them managing trillions of dollars in global assets, begin pulling back from international markets to manage domestic crises and domestic political pressures, that withdrawal has downstream effects that ripple through pension funds and investment portfolios and retirement accounts on every continent. The financial crisis of 2008 taught the world a painful lesson about how deeply interconnected global banking really is, how quickly a problem in one corner of the financial system can spread to every other corner. This conflict is providing a refresher course in that same lesson, and we are not yet anywhere near the end of it. Meanwhile, inside Iran, or what remains of Iran's organized government structure after the devastating strikes on its nuclear and military infrastructure, a power struggle is unfolding that may ultimately determine whether this war ends in a negotiated settlement or spirals into something truly catastrophic, something that would render everything we have discussed so far merely the opening act. Understanding that power struggle requires understanding who Mojtaba Khomeini is, how he came to power, and what his position at the top of a wounded, disoriented, internally fractured regime actually means for the trajectory of this conflict. Mojtaba Khomeini is the second son of the late Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. He spent decades operating in the background of Iranian political life, running sensitive intelligence operations through IRGC channels, building a carefully maintained network of loyalists within the Revolutionary Guards and the clerical establishment, positioning himself through years of quiet maneuvering as the natural ideological heir to his father's revolutionary project. He was, in the eyes of the hardline faction of the Iranian establishment, the ideal successor. Someone who would preserve the Islamic Republic's revolutionary identity without the compromises and pragmatic accommodations that figures like former President Rouhani had sometimes been willing to make in the interests of economic normalization and diplomatic engagement. But he was never supposed to come to power this way. Not in the middle of a war, not wounded from a strike that left him, according to American Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, disfigured. not with the physical infrastructure of the Islamic Republic in ruins, the nuclear program destroyed, the air defenses degraded, the economy already buckling under decades of sanctions, now compounded by the costs of active conflict. The circumstances of his accession have created an internal dynamic within the Iranian government that is simultaneously the most dangerous and the most potentially hopeful dimension of this entire crisis, because it means that Iran is not speaking with one voice. Iran is speaking with competing voices, and the question of which voice wins will determine whether the world gets a ceasefire or an escalation into something that no one can come back from. Iranian President Pezeshkian, a relative moderate who won his election on a platform of pragmatic engagement with the outside world, economic reform, and a willingness to explore diplomatic solutions to Iran's international isolation, has apparently issued orders to halt the strikes on Gulf states. He has issued something approaching a public apology to the Gulf governments, acknowledging that attacks on civilian infrastructure in countries like the UAE and Qatar are not in Iran's strategic interest. He understands, from a position of extraordinary weakness, that Iran cannot afford to make enemies of every neighboring country simultaneously, that the path to Iranian survival in this crisis runs not through expanding the conflict, but through isolating the United States and Israel as the aggressors, while positioning Iran as the victim seeking accommodation. But the Revolutionary Guards are not listening to him. The IRGC answers not to the civilian president, not even fully to a supreme leader who is wounded and isolated and still consolidating his own internal authority. It answers to its own institutional command structure, its own revolutionary ideology, and its own strategic doctrine. A doctrine built around the conviction that the moment Iran shows weakness is the moment its enemies accelerate. That every missile fired at a Saudi oil field, every drone that reaches a Dubai hotel, every tanker that turns back at the entrance to the Strait, every interceptor missile Bahrain has to fire, each of these imposes a cost that raises the political price of continuing the war for Washington and Riyadh. It is a theory of conflict that says the way out is not through weakness, but through making the enemy's position progressively more untenable. And so you have this extraordinary situation where Iran's civilian government is trying to stop a war that Iran's military has decided it needs to continue fighting. A leadership rift so severe, so fundamental to the institutional architecture of the Islamic Republic, that it represents either the beginning of a political transformation inside Iran, a shift toward the pragmatists, and away from the hardliners that could eventually open a path toward negotiation, or the trigger for a brutal internal consolidation of power by the IRGC that would end any realistic prospect of a diplomatic settlement and lock the region into a long-term conflict with no clear endpoint. This is the knife's edge the world is sitting on right now. France has already lost a soldier, a French military advisor killed by an Iranian drone strike in Kurdistan in northern Iraq, the first Western military fatality of this conflict. And France's response was not outrage. It was something quieter and more revealing. A carefully worded foreign ministry statement reserving the right to respond to attacks on French personnel, combined with private communications to Washington, making clear that France is not prepared to be dragged into a war it was not consulted about, that it did not endorse, and that it does not believe serves Western interests. The NATO alliance, already under strain from years of burden-sharing arguments and the difficult politics of the Ukraine conflict, is now fracturing along additional lines, and adversaries in Moscow and Beijing are watching those fracture lines with very careful attention. Because Russia and China have not been passive observers to any of this, Russia, which has been providing Iran with advanced drone technology, electronic warfare systems, and the kind of satellite intelligence that makes precision targeting of distant facilities possible, has every incentive to see this conflict continue as long as possible. Every day the Gulf is in chaos is a day that Russian oil exports, flowing through routes that bypass the Strait of Hormuz entirely, command premium prices. Every dollar that energy prices rise globally is a dollar flowing into Russian state coffers, helping Moscow sustain its war economy in Ukraine despite Western sanctions. Every NATO alliance meeting consumed by Gulf crisis management is a meeting that is not focused on Ukraine, not focused on Baltic security, not focused on any of the other dimensions of Russian strategy. Vladimir Putin did not start this war, but he is benefiting from it in ways that are almost perfectly calibrated to his interests, and he has no reason whatsoever to use whatever influence he retains with Tehran to help bring it to an end. China's position is more complex, more nuanced, and ultimately more consequential than Russia's. Because China is the world's largest importer of Gulf oil, China needs Gulf energy to run its manufacturing economy in a way that no other major power does. Chinese refineries are specifically engineered around Gulf crude specifications. Chinese industrial supply chains assume the reliable, affordable availability of Gulf energy as a baseline condition. And so China faces this extraordinary and genuinely uncomfortable strategic contradiction. It is ideologically and geopolitically aligned with Iran in its opposition to American military dominance of the greater Middle East, It has deep financial and infrastructure relationships with Iran through the Belt and Road Initiative. It has been publicly critical of American and Israeli military action. But it also desperately and urgently needs the Strait of Hormuz to remain open, because Chinese economic growth and Chinese political stability depends on it. And nobody can predict with confidence which of those competing interests will dominate Beijing's decision-making as this crisis deepens and the economic costs begin to mount. What we do know is that Chinese diplomatic channels to Tehran have been extraordinarily active since the conflict began. Chinese officials at the highest levels have been in direct contact with both the Iranian government and, reportedly, with IRGC command structure figures. And while China is not publicly positioning itself as a mediator, it will not take that political risk with its domestic audience, will not be seen as working to help resolve a conflict that American aggression started. It is clearly communicating to Tehran that the continued disruption of Gulf oil flows is a problem that Beijing takes with the utmost seriousness. Whether that communication translates into any actual constraint on IRGC operational planning remains the critical unknown. And now let us look at Bahrain. Because Bahrain is a case study in exactly how impossible this entire situation has become for the small Gulf states caught between Iranian military power and American military presence. Bahrain hosts the United States Fifth Fleet, the American naval command responsible for the Gulf region, the Arabian Sea, the Red Sea, and significant parts of the Indian Ocean. The Fifth Fleet is not merely a military installation. It is the physical embodiment of American power projection into the Gulf. It is the reason that Gulf shipping lanes have been, for decades, as relatively secure as they have been. It is, in the most fundamental sense, the ultimate guarantor of everything MBS spent $1 trillion assuming he could rely upon. Since the conflict began, Bahrain has intercepted over 114 missiles and nearly 200 drones. Bahrain, a country smaller than the city of Los Angeles, a small island connected by a causeway to Saudi Arabia, has been absorbing hundreds of Iranian projectiles to protect an American base and preserve the fiction that Gulf stability is still maintainable. And every interceptor missile Bahrain fires, every Patriot battery that lights up the sky over Manama, depletes the very defensive arsenal that is supposed to protect Bahraini civilians from the next wave. There's a finite number of interceptors in any inventory. Iran has demonstrated the capacity to manufacture cheap, effective drones faster than any Gulf state can fire missiles at them. The mathematics of attrition favor Tehran in a way that no rapid American rearmament can quickly address. This is a race that the defenders are losing even when they are winning in any individual engagement. BAPCO, Bahrain Petroleum Company, the national oil company, has declared force majeure on its refinery operations following strike damage. Force majeure is the legal term companies use when circumstances beyond their control prevent them from meeting contractual obligations. It is the language of insurance claims and canceled supply contracts and downstream shortages rippling through global supply chains. It is the language of economic damage becoming measurable and real and expensive for people who have no connection to the politics or the grievances or the history that produced this conflict. The ripple effects from Bahrain alone are being felt in unexpected places around the world. Japanese automobile manufacturers, who source components from facilities that process Gulf refined materials, are adjusting production schedules and placing emergency calls to alternative suppliers. South Korean electronics companies that use refined products from Gulf processing plants are convening risk management sessions and reviewing force majeure clauses in their own supplier contracts. European energy companies that have structured long-term LNG agreements around Gulf supply assumptions are consulting lawyers about what they can and cannot legally do. The war has already moved inside the global economy. It is not a future risk to be hedged and managed. It is a present reality being lived and paid for right now. Now let us pull all of this back to the core question, the question that everything we have discussed leads to, the question that the title of this video promises to answer honestly and completely. Did Mohammed bin Salman secretly buy the American military? Let us be precise about what that question means and what it does not mean. It does not mean that the United States is merely a mercenary army for Saudi Arabia with no interests or values of its own. The American concern about Iranian nuclear weapons is genuine and long-standing and bipartisan. It predates MBS, predates Trump, predates the current administration entirely. The strategic relationship between the United States and Israel is deep and complex and rooted in shared democratic values, shared intelligence cooperation, and decades of military partnership that cannot be reduced to Saudi financial influence. The security architecture of the Gulf has always reflected real American national interests in energy security, freedom of navigation, counterterrorism, and regional stability. These things are real. They matter. They provide legitimate reasons for American engagement in the region. But here is the but that changes everything about this situation. None of those genuine American interests required acting on MBS's timeline, with MBS's urgency, at MBS's insistence, in the precise and consequential manner that MBS reportedly requested. The United States had been living with Iranian nuclear ambiguity and Iranian military capability for years. Diplomats across multiple administrations had been working, imperfectly and frustratingly and often unsuccessfully, through diplomatic channels to constrain Iranian behavior without triggering a regional war. The decision to move from strategic pressure and diplomatic negotiation to kinetic military strikes against Iranian territory, the decision that set off this entire cascade of economic and military consequences, was made in a specific window of time, at a specific moment in history, following specific private conversations between a Saudi prince and an American president. And the financial context of those conversations cannot be ignored or minimized. The trillion-dollar financial architecture that MBS constructed over a decade, the arms deals, the investment fund commitments, the lobbying infrastructure, the sovereign wealth fund deployments into American assets, the endowments and the advertising budgets and the think tank funding, created a set of incentives, dependencies, and relationships that made American decision makers structurally more receptive to Saudi arguments than they would otherwise have been. It did not corrupt the process in any simple or direct sense. It shaped the process. It tilted the playing field in a direction that made a decision for military action feel more natural, more supported, more inevitable than it would have been if that financial architecture did not exist. That is not a conspiracy. That is not a dramatic or sensationalized reading of events. That is how power actually works in the world we live in. Money does not buy decisions directly. It builds relationships over years, shapes incentives gradually, creates dependencies incrementally, and makes certain outcomes feel like common sense while making other outcomes feel reckless or unrealistic. And when $1 trillion flows consistently in one direction over a decade, the river of influence it creates is real and consequential, even if nobody in Washington ever signed a document saying that in exchange for this financial relationship, the United States will take military action against Iran on Saudi Arabia's preferred timeline. The question of whether that $1 trillion was well spent for Saudi Arabia is one that MBS is now presumably grappling with in real time. From his palace in Riyadh, watching drone alerts light up his country's eastern province, watching oil prices that should be enriching Saudi Arabia instead being disrupted by a war that Saudi lobbying helped trigger, watching the regional economic integration projects and the Vision 2030 modernization agenda, he staked his entire legacy on being threatened by the very conflict he encouraged. The brilliant strategic genius who was supposed to transform Saudi Arabia into a post-oil economic powerhouse, who was supposed to make Riyadh the financial and cultural capital of the Arab world, is watching oil infrastructure burn in a war he helped start. The man who spent a decade constructing an intricate architecture of American military protection is now discovering that American military power can bomb Iran, can destroy nuclear facilities, can degrade missile arsenals. But it cannot protect Saudi Arabia from everything Iran can do in response across a body of water that separates two countries with a long history of mutual hostility. Because here is the fundamental strategic miscalculation embedded in the heart of MBS's entire approach. He understood financial leverage, he understood influence and dependency, and how to construct relationships that made his own position indispensable. He understood how to make himself immune to consequences that would have destroyed the reputation and the freedom of any ordinary person. But he misunderstood geography. He misunderstood the asymmetry of exposure that separates Saudi Arabia from the United States in a Gulf conflict. He misunderstood the difference between American power projected at a distance, the kind that can strike nuclear facilities from B-2 bombers flying from the middle of the Indian Ocean, and the vulnerability that Saudi Arabia faces as a neighbor to Iran, separated not by oceans and thousands of miles of strategic buffer, but by the waters of the Persian Gulf. Iran cannot hurt the continental United States the way it can hurt Saudi Arabia. Iran cannot mine the harbors of New York or Los Angeles. Iran cannot send drone swarms to strike refineries in Texas or pipelines in Alaska. The geographic distance that makes American military intervention in the Gulf relatively low cost for America simultaneously makes Iranian military retaliation completely irrelevant to American territory. But for Saudi Arabia, sitting directly across the Gulf from a wounded, angry, and strategically sophisticated Iran, every single one of those protective distances works in reverse. Iran can reach Saudi Arabia in ways it cannot reach America. And MBS, in his brilliant and patient pursuit of American military power, forgot to build inadequate insurance against the inevitable cost of the military action he was purchasing. This is the $1 trillion mistake. Not the money itself. The money bought real things, real influence, real weapons. The mistake is the strategic misunderstanding embedded in the strategy. The belief that purchasing American military willingness to act would translate cleanly into Saudi security, when what it actually purchased was American willingness to act in a way that imposed massive and immediate costs on the very country that had paid for the action. MBS bought the trigger pull, but did not fully account for the recoil, and now the world is left managing consequences that nobody planned for and nobody knows how to end. Oil markets in permanent turbulence for the foreseeable future, with every price spike cascading through food prices and transportation costs and manufacturing inputs for billions of people who never voted for any of the decisions that produced this crisis. The Strait of Hormuz operating at a fraction of its normal capacity, with the insurance costs and the mine threat keeping the shipping lanes far below what the global economy requires to function normally. A global economy absorbing an inflationary shock it was not prepared for at a moment of genuine fragility. A NATO alliance fracturing under the pressure of a war its European members were not consulted about and cannot afford to be drawn into. A China watching its energy security and its economic growth assumptions evaporate in real time, calculating its options with the full weight of its economic and diplomatic power. A Russia actively benefiting from every additional day of chaos and every additional dollar on the price of oil. A France burying its first soldier of this conflict and delivering quiet ultimatums to Washington. A Bahrain firing its last reserves of interceptor missiles against an enemy that manufactures drones faster than Bahrain can replace what it fires. And at the center of all of it, at the center of every burning oil field and every drone-filled sky and every tanker turning back from the strait and every stock market in freefall, is a decision that was made in a specific set of phone calls, in a specific set of private conversations, between a Saudi prince who spent $1 trillion building leverage and an American president who, whether consciously or not, exercised that leverage exactly as it was designed to be exercised. The Strait of Hormuz will eventually reopen. Wars eventually end. Oil markets eventually find equilibrium. The economic damage, however severe, will eventually be absorbed and worked through by the resilience of the global economy and the populations that depend on it. But the structural questions this conflict has exposed about American foreign policy decision-making, about the relationship between financial influence and military commitment, about the accountability gap that allows a $1 trillion influence architecture to shape decisions that affect the lives of billions of people who had no voice in them, those questions will not go away when the drones stop flying and the fires in the eastern province are finally extinguished. Because the next time a foreign leader with deep financial ties to Washington wants the American military to act, they will have this precedent to point to. They will know that it worked. That patient, systematic financial investment in American institutions, American relationships, and American dependencies can move the most powerful military in history. And the question of whether America can maintain a coherent, principled, interest-based foreign policy, a policy accountable to American voters rather than to foreign sovereign wealth funds and arms deal relationships, in a world where financial leverage has become the most powerful weapon in any strategic arsenal, that is the question that will define the next decade of international relations. Because what MBS understood, and what this crisis has made undeniable, is that the rules-based international order that the United States spent the second half of the 20th century constructing and defending is not protected by principles alone. It is protected by interests. And when interests can be shaped by money, when the financial architecture of a relationship can make certain decisions feel like common sense and others feel impossible, then the order itself becomes available for purchase. And that is a lesson that every ambitious leader watching this crisis unfold in Beijing and Moscow and Riyadh and Tel Aviv and Islamabad and everywhere else has now been taught at extraordinary cost and will not forget. This is what a $1 trillion mistake looks like when it catches up with you. This is what happens when financial leverage meets military reality and geographic vulnerability all at once. And the terrifying truth, the truth that keeps the people who actually understand this conflict awake at night, is that nobody in any relevant position of power, not in Washington, not in Riyadh, not in Tehran, and certainly not in the boardrooms of the defense contractors counting their profits from every interceptor missile fired and every weapon system rushed to theater. Nobody has a clear and credible answer to the most important question of this moment. Not how this ends, but how it stops before the knife's edge tips in the wrong direction, before a wounded and politically desperate new supreme leader makes the calculation that his own survival requires an escalation that crosses a line nobody can walk back from. Before one miscalculation, one misidentified target, one unauthorized launch by a commander who does not know the full diplomatic picture takes a regional catastrophe and transforms it into something that none of us have adequate language for yet. That is where we are, on the morning of March 14th, 2026. That is the world the $1 trillion mistake has produced. And that is why, more than perhaps any moment in living memory, what matters is not just understanding what is happening, the explosions and the drone alerts and the tanker rerouting and the stock market numbers, but understanding how it happened. Who made the decisions? Who built the architecture that made those decisions feel inevitable? Who paid for them? And who is paying for them now? In oil prices and food costs and insurance premiums and fractured alliances and children growing up in countries that are on fire because of a transaction that most of their parents never knew was being made. Pay attention. Because the next chapter of this story is being written right now, and the choices made in the next few days and weeks will determine whether what we are living through becomes a crisis that the world navigates and learns from, or the opening act of something far larger and far darker than anyone was willing to admit was possible. Stay informed. Think critically. And never stop asking who benefits, who pays, and who decided. Because here is the final truth that this entire story leaves us with. The greatest threat to American power in the 21st century is not Iran's missiles or China's economy or Russia's aggression. It is the slow, invisible erosion of the principle that American power should serve American people and American values, not the financial interests of foreign princes who have learned, through patient investment and careful relationship building over years, exactly how to make American power serve theirs. Every alliance requires trust. Every partnership requires reciprocity. And when a relationship becomes so financially entangled that it is no longer possible to distinguish American interests from the interests of the party that has spent $1 trillion ensuring that America cannot tell the difference, that is the moment the republic itself is at risk. Not from an external attack, from the inside, from the quiet, legal, entirely undramatic process by which money shapes perception, perception shapes policy, and policy shapes history. That is the story of this war, and that is the warning it carries for every war that comes after it.